Welcome to Finance 101. My name is Michael Dunham. I'm the Director of Planning here at Fontana Financial Planning, and today we're going to talk about going off to college and paying for school with a 529. And with that, we're going to look to answer a couple of questions in today's video. So the questions we're going to answer: what is a qualified education expense? What is not a qualified education expense? How should you pay for qualified education expenses? What documentation should you keep? And how should you prioritize spending if you have more than one 529 plan to use? So one thing to note for this video, we're going to focus on kids that are in college. There are other ways to use 529 funds, like paying for private K through 12 education. Those expenses may have other requirements to be aware of, so note that this is specifically for kids going off to college. So the first question to answer is, what expenses qualify as an educational expense out of a 529 plan? So one thing to know, there's no limit on the dollar amount that can qualify. If you have a kid going off to school, you may notice that education has gotten a lot more expensive than it may have been when you went off to school. And there's no dollar limit that we need to be aware of. Qualifying education expenses are going to include tuition and fees for the university or college that they're attending, room and board, with the caveat that the student must be enrolled at least half time to qualify, books and supplies, and then things like computers, iPads, internet, software. That's all going to qualify as an educational expense. On the other hand, what is not going to qualify as an educational expense? A big one is transportation. So paying for a car for your kid to go off to school, or even airfare to and from school. Those items are not going to qualify. College application and testing fees. So if you're paying for SAT, ACT, prep, or actually taking the tests, those are not going to qualify as educational expenses. Club fees, so the big one here is fraternity or sorority dues. Note that the housing cost portion of those organizational expenses can qualify, but not the dues and intramural costs. And then finally, health insurance is another big one that does not count as a qualified education expense. A common question that we get when people go off to school, or when their kids go off to school, is how to pay for the expenses. So there's three common ways that you can do it. The first is you can reimburse yourself from the 529 and then pay the expenses with the reimbursed funds. Alternatively, you can pay the expenses first and then reimburse yourself from the 529 with the accumulated expense amount. Or the third option is just paying the school directly. So this will be common if there's a big tuition bill, say you owe $20,000 to university, you can just cut a check directly from the 529 and mail it straight to the university. The big thing to note there is the distribution from the 529 needs to happen in the same calendar year that the expense occurs on. Often this can be messed up when you're going from fall to spring semester, and say you've got a spring semester bill due in January. You don't want to take the money out in December in advance of paying that bill. You want to make sure that it's taken out in the same calendar year. So what documentation should you keep for qualified expenses that you pay for? So a couple tax forms to know about. Your 529 administrator will issue what's called a 1099-Q every year, and that's going to detail the distributions that you took out of the 529 account. And then the university that your child is attending is going to release what's called a 1098-T. That is generally going to have things like tuition costs, fees that they may have paid, potentially room and board if they're living on campus. And then for everything else, it's a good practice to keep receipts for any purchases that you make. So if you go buy a new laptop, we want to keep a receipt to show how much we paid for it. You don't need to have any of these things to file with your taxes, But in the case that you get audited and you need to justify any expenses, it's a good practice to have those on hand and be ready to do that. The last question that we run into from time to time is if there's multiple 529 plans set up for one child, how should you prioritize spending? So a lot of times this will happen if both parents and grandparents have set up a 529 plan for a child. And the thing that you want to know there is it's going to be best to use the parents' 529 plan first and then use any other 529s set up for the child, so like grandparents or other friends or relatives who may have set one up. And the reason for this is non-parental 529 distributions can count as income on the child's FAFSA, and it can impact their financial aid awards and grants that they may be eligible for. So we don't want to take those funds out prematurely in the first couple of years of school where the FAFSA can be really important. So that is everything for this video. If you found it helpful, please feel free to like down below and share, and subscribe if you'd like some more great financial planning content from us.